cares if you like literally what is worse? Somebody like having a drink now and then at a bar, or constantly looking for validation from a maker that will never come. Or your liver can cleanse itself, but you need full-blown Stephen Hassan cult conditioning expert to come in and people to pay people like him to be able to unfuck your brain from what I just described on the other one.
Yeah. In your work, how many people do you see in the prison that are in prison because of Mormonism versus in prison because of alcohol? If you could put a ratio on it, what would you say there? Just crazy that like that alcohol is somehow less harmful than Mormonism. It ignores the data. Clearly, it ignores the data. And it's like alcohol, okay, I'm going to honestly, and this is a tangent, I think alcohol should be illegal. Shoot me. um Hey everybody, welcome to Actual Mormons. Today joining me as always is Jacob Mayberry. Jacob, how you doing?
Doing excellent. How are you?
I am doing great. Today we're going to be responding to Kara, NuanceHoe's video on, as she claims, one of the most toxic parts of Mormonism. And yeah, Jacob, this is kind of your field of expertise, right?
Yeah. So I have a bachelor's degree in psychology, a master's degree in criminal justice, and I'm currently getting my PhD in criminal justice. I've also done quite a bit of personal research on the literature, the social scientific literature on Mormonism and mental health, um, Mormonism and crime and delinquency, as well as just the general religion and health literature. So I've read a lot of that. So I'm looking forward to seeing what her claims are and how it squares with the data.
Awesome. All right, well, with that, do you have anything to add before we let her speak?
Yeah. So whenever a critic claims that Mormonism is harmful, I always ask them compared to what? What is the baseline that you're using? And so I'm hoping to see an improvement from critics because I'm not against them criticizing the church. I just want them to use good arguments, good data, and to be clear about what they are claiming. Um, do you think that the church should be perfect, and do they fall short of that? And is that your argument? Um, what is the baseline you're using to claim that the church is harmful? And really, when you're claiming that the church is harmful, the burden of evidence is on you to prove that. Um, I'm more than happy to debunk a lot of this, but like at the outset, we have to say that if a critic is going to say the church is harmful, the burden of evidence is on you.
I absolutely agree. And my thing with like the broad claims of like Mormonism is harmful is like we're a church with millions of members. Of course, we are going to have situations where people are stupid and do bad things and harm people. Like it's of course people are going to be hurt in our religion. There's so many people, and there's like who are totally involved in this religion. People are going to get hurt along the way, and we should absolutely talk about those things, and we should hear those stories, and we should find ways to fix them. But I agree with you that when we're talking about the religion at large and making general claims against the membership and the faith, we should be using the best available data and what it says. So with that, I think let's let Kara give her full perspective here, and then we can respond.
Sounds good.
All right, Kara, take it away.
The pushback that I would hear from Mormons about that is they just project that people who are not in the church or just have addictions. They're addicted to porn. They're addicted to cigarettes and alcohol. They can't possibly imagine, let alone for themselves, but that other people could be happy. That hustle for love, that conditional love. There is nothing more toxic in the world than conditional love from a maker or from a community. People just want to be able to be authentic. They want to be in their own skin. Who cares if you like literally what is worse? Somebody like having a drink now and then at a bar, or constantly looking for validation from a maker that will never come, or from a community or from a parent that will never come, and never being your authentic self. Like, which one is more damaging to the soul overall? Your liver can cleanse itself, but you need full-blown Stephen Hassan cult conditioning expert to come in and people to pay people like him to be able to unfuck your brain from what I just described on the other one. And it's heartbreaking.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's it. That's quite a few claims in there. What I got is Mormons don't think anyone else can be happy. Mormons think everyone else is addicted to things.
Yeah,
There's
if you
nothing more
leave the
toxic
church,
than
yeah, if you leave the church, then it's because you were addicted to something or you were sinning or something like that.
yeah,
That's the
yeah.
beginning
There's
of the
nothing more
video.
toxic than conditional love is another one. What's worse, occasional drinking or religious validation is another one I caught. And then the liver can heal, but Stephen Hassan needs to. You need to pay Stephen Hassan to fix your religious trauma. So
Yeah,
I
and
think let's take those one by one if that works for you.
yeah, and that the church keeps people from being their authentic selves because of that hustle for love, that
Yes.
toxic perfectionism. Um,
Yeah.
so first, I want to extend grace to Kara because there are members who do believe that if you leave church, it's because you were addicted to something or that you were sinning, and so you just didn't want to be
Oh
in the
yeah.
church anymore because you didn't want to be beholden to their standards. There are members
I
who think that.
That's a thing I definitely heard growing up too. I've heard that in seminary. I've heard that in Sunday school. Like if people leave the church, it's because of some like secret hidden sin. Like that's not. There's plenty of members that believe that, and I probably was one of them for a lot of my life. So um, I definitely extend grace there.
Well, and she comes. I think she comes from a very like fundamentalist, conservative Mormon background. Like her parents are a big fan of Rod Meldrum, the Heartlanders, and so
Yeah,
that's
I
where
would I
that's
would
kind of the background she
say
comes from.
yeah, I think so. I always like to substitute. We often use the word fundamentalist to describe like Heartlanders. I like to say traditionalist because when fundamentalist, that's like more like Joseph Smith, um, exact teachings and more loyalty there. I like to say traditionalist because it comes out of like traditions of Mormonism from Joseph Fielding Smith, Bruce R. McConkie, and that's where I think Kara comes from. I know her parents bought her like a Hannah Stoddard book at one point
Right, right.
to try to like fix her testimony, which is not a great
No,
way to go about it.
nope.
But yeah, so I would say traditionalist is where she comes from.
On the flip side, ex-Mormons will try and claim that people who leave the church only had honorable reasons for doing so. That there are people who leave the church because they wanted to sin. Those people exist, but I wouldn't say that they make up every single person that leaves.
Yeah, yeah, of course, of course. We got to stay away from those generalizations. Um, yeah, Mormons think that nobody else can be happy. What do you think about that claim?
Um, I mean, at the individual level, I think that people can be happy without being Mormon or like believing in the gospel in general or just being Christian. Um, However, at the population level, I think that if we saw like the entire United States suddenly stop believing in Christianity, I think that we would see an overall decline in moral behavior. Um, so there's a. Do you know who Jordan Peterson is?
Yeah, yeah, I've listened to quite a bit of Jordan Peterson.
I know a lot of like probably our more left wing listeners, if we have any, will probably roll their eyes when I bring up Jordan Peterson, but he has a lot of good insights. And his most recent book, uh, there's a really profound quote I just want to share here. It's basically about how we need to look at things from a big, a broader perspective than just at the individual level. He says, quote, if I value something, I must determine how to value it so that others potentially benefit. It cannot just be good for me. It must be good for me and for the people around me. And even that is not good enough, which means that there are even more constraints on how the world must be perceived and acted upon. The manner in which I view the world has to work for me, my family, and the broader community. Furthermore, it needs to work today in a manner that does not make a worse hash of tomorrow, next week, next month, and next year, and even the next decade or century. A good solution to a problem involving suffering must be repeatable without deterioration across repetitions, across people, and across time. So I personally think that Kara's way of thinking is a product of us living in an increasingly secular and expressive individualistic society. And the error in this way of thinking is that we should not only consider how our actions affect us, but how they affect those that fall under our sphere of influence and may look to us as an example of how to live happy lives. Our children, younger siblings, friends, and even our descendants hundreds of years from now would fall into this group. God's commandments are not just meant to create stable individuals, they are meant to create stable families, communities, and societies. And we should consider how our actions affect those around us. And not just that, we should also consider how our actions affect our descendants several generations from now. And so, like, people can be happy outside of the church, outside of Christianity, or even outside of religion. However, I think that a when we see large populations begin to abandon the faith, then we'll see a moral decline. And I think the data bears that out, and we can get to that later.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm with you there. And I definitely grew up as well with the saying, like, the greatest happiness is found within the church. And to a certain point, I agree with that. I think at its like life at its best is at its closest to Christ, at least from my lived experience. Um, but yeah, I definitely think there's plenty of people that can be very happy outside of the church, um, and have, and I think there are cases where people will genuinely be happier outside of the church than they are inside of the church in a lot of circumstances. Um, but I think if we're speaking in general, and Kara likes to speak in really broad general terms, I think for the vast majority of humans right now, the happiest and best place to live is within the following the church in a thoughtful way, not just taking everything at face value, right? But striving to be like Christ, building a community around you, um, living the word of wisdom, yeah, helping your neighbor, yeah, following the teachings of Christ that are um, apparent in the church. I would say is for the vast majority of humans is a great way to live.
Right. And like when it comes to like making it to heaven or to the celestial kingdom, I do believe that the church is the only true church when it comes to that. But as far as uh, human flourishing and happiness in this life, applying gospel principles is most definitely required in order to create stable communities and societies. Not and like focusing on the individual first isn't the way to go because like there are things that can make certain individuals happy that aren't necessarily good for society if everyone were to do them. So focusing on how to create stable societies first will inevitably lead to more stable individuals overall, a greater number of stable individuals.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's 100%, and that's the church at a general level. That's their job. The
Hmm.
leadership of the church is to establish principles that work in general. Obviously, when we get down into the church and down into the wards and the stakes, there's complexity there, and it allows it, you know allows for a little bit more nuance and personal ministry to people who are struggling. But in general, I think that the principles that the church is teaching at a general level are absolutely helpful and um, pave the way to really great joy in this life. Um, and do we have data on the data that talks about like what does the data say about Mormons' happiness in comparison to the average person?
So, if you want to see me break this down, you can go on to Robert Boylan's YouTube channel, and I gave a presentation there called, I think it's entitled "Mormonism and Well-Being." I also participated in a debate on the Thoughtful Faith podcast with a guy named Robert Alkinsell, where I break down the data. You can My Substack article is linked in the show notes, and I think both of those. But from about 1960 to 2022, there have been like 158 studies published on the subject of Mormonism and mental health. And like they don't all just measure happiness directly. They measure like depression, anxiety, suicidality, crime and delinquency, uh, social competence, all sorts of stuff, all sorts of variables. And the vast majority of those studies show that Mormonism is positive for mental health. It's good for mental health. And this squares with the general literature on Christianity and mental health, which is a much bigger literature. Um, there's an edition of a handbook called the Handbook of Religion and Health. It's like 1,200 pages, like that thick. I'm waiting for it in Amazon right now. It's the third edition, so there's other editions as well, and just full of like thousands of studies on Christianity and mental health. The the literature for Mormonism isn't as big, but still, it's 158 studies published in the last few decades that basically show the same thing. And it also shows that in many studies that Mormons fare better than Protestant or Catholic Christians in many variables that are meant to study mental health.
Awesome. Yeah, that data perfectly matches my lived experience and my life. I see that people part of the church are very generally happy people, um, who love the church and love being a part of it. So yeah, that matches what I observe. What about what do you think? I think this is a pretty outlandish claim that there's nothing more toxic than conditional love. Do you have any thoughts? I think that's pretty outlandish. I mean, I don't think this is might get me a little destroyed here, but I don't think unconditional love exists. I genuinely don't. If I have a kid and my kid becomes a horrific human being, like I have Jeffrey Dahmer as my son, I'm not gonna love him anymore. I'm sorry to break the news. I'm not gonna. If he becomes a serial killer, like sorry, I just don't. I don't know. What do you think?
Well, I mean,
Yeah.
Jeffrey Dahmer's dad continued to visit him when he was in prison. Like, better man than me. He still cultivated his relationship with his son.
Yeah.
Uh, but yeah, like I don't think there's a such thing as unconditional love either. And I don't think Kara really believes that either. Like we just differ on what the conditions are. Um, when it comes to people who say like I don't believe in being judgmental, like I'm sure when push comes to shove, you actually do. We just differ on what we should be judgmental of. Or they say I don't believe in shaming people. Well, yeah, you do. We just differ on what behavior should be shamed. Um, yeah, I don't buy that, and I don't think that the church really teaches conditional love anyway. They teach conditional approval of behavior. They teach conditional approval. Like God doesn't approve of everything we do.
Yeah. And in ways, I think it's pretty healthy to live in a way that you have expectations of being a good person.
Hmm.
Like, and call that conditional love whatever you want, but having a religious system, having constantly having the expectation like you should be a good person. You should reach out to your neighbors. You should find ways to better yourself, better your health, better your spirituality, gain a deeper connection with God and Christ. I don't think that's bad. Obviously, if it's taken to extremes and weird interpretations of how that is played out, that can be harmful. But as a general principle, and again, we're speaking in generals here, I think having expectations of you from a religion that's constantly putting pressure on you to do good and to be good um, is a great thing.
Yeah. Well, and she may counter like you shouldn't need people to put pressure on you or shame you to do what's right. Well, I mean, that society is built to an extent on shame. Like society sets standards for what is acceptable behavior, and when you don't live up to those expectations, people shame you. And there's an effective way to do that. Like there's a good article by Vox that came out a few years ago. It's called "Why Shame Is Good," and it's based off of a book written by a psychotherapist. And he basically argues that shame is bad when it's directed at the person. Like you are a terrible human being because you did this. It's actually very effective when you focus on specific behaviors that a person should stop doing, and then you offer them an avenue to actually change their behavior and then re-enter society as a restored citizen of that society, which sounds a lot like the repentance process, which the church teaches. And so I think that's just the way any stable society functions. And when push comes to shove, like I said earlier, Kara believes that too. We just differ on which behaviors should be shamed.
Yeah. It's like if I, like have a friend who goes and steals quite a bit of money from a grocery store, right? Like I don't need to like cut off my relationship with my friend or tell them that they're a terrible person, but I can also say, yeah, that behavior, that's wrong. You shouldn't do that. You shouldn't steal from people. And sure, that's shame. Like shame is just like I feel like it's such a people interpret it as such a dirty word,
Mhm.
but like that's just how we function in society. We shame behaviors. Stealing is bad. Hurting an elderly person is bad. Like there's so many things that are bad that are shameful. It doesn't mean we need to trash on people or try to like embarrass people in public or try to make them look stupid at church. But yeah, we absolutely should hold shameful ideas to certain behaviors that are wrong.
Yeah, we should have standards, and there should be some type of, I don't know, I don't want to call it penalty, but some type of consequence imposed by society when people don't uh, live up to those standards. But we should do it in the most Christ-like way possible and offer them a way, like a way to change and reform themselves. Now, she talks about like people just want to be their authentic self, rather than live up to these perfectionistic standards of society. But what does authentic self mean? Because I'm a corrections officer, I work around people who wanted to be their authentic selves and it ended them up in prison. And that didn't end up well for them. Like, what if your authentic self is a really shitty person? Like that's it's just a buzzword that our society uses these days as a way to say, I'm just going to do me. I'm not going to live up to anyone's expectations. But it's an attitude that like borders on narcissism. Because what if your authentic self isn't a good person? And that's where society comes in. When a person wants to be their authentic self and their authentic self isn't a good person, we tell them to cut it out. And if you want to be a functioning member of society, you got to change yourself. And in the extreme example, we send people to prison. That's a way of shaming them so that they don't do it again. But for other behaviors that are unacceptable but aren't like crimes, there are ways that society and the church lets people know that this isn't okay and you need to change. And there's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah, if I want to be my authentic self right now and take it to the extreme, I would just stay inside and play video games and do nothing all day.
Hmm.
That's my authentic self. That's what I want to do. I want to be a hermit in my house and contribute nothing to the world. That's just like that is the natural impulse to me. And it's like I understand the message of be your authentic self. Like I think there's a lot of good intention behind it. Like don't shy away from things that are unique to you and make you a beautiful individual human being. Um, but I do think it's flawed. I think a lot of times people are using it in a way of like, just be the natural man, be your natural man, you know. And at the end of the day, like the beautiful message of the gospel is that we give ourselves to Christ, and through the refiner's fire, through the atonement, we can burn away those natural fallen parts of ourselves that are harmful and are bad and cause us to hurt other people and to hurt ourselves and hurt our situations. And we can refine the beautiful and authentic parts of ourselves. So I think that if we approached being your authentic self that way, of like take the best parts of yourself and have help use Christ and the gospel or however, and make those as bright and shine those as bright as possible, instead of just the general kind of lazy statement, oh, just be your authentic self. That's the way to live life.
Right.
I don't know. What do you think?
Well, Bruce C. Hafen, he gave a talk when he was 70, basically like, um, you're pulling the weeds out of your garden and then cultivating the plants that you want to grow, the flowers. That's all what the gospel is all about. And so we get rid of the bad parts of our authentic self and we cultivate the good parts of our authentic self. Now, what Kara is, I think her like she doesn't realize this, but the authentic self line that she's using is based off of a concept called expressive individualism. Now, the concept of expressive individualism suggests that to be content and genuine and be your authentic self, one must have the ability to publicly express, or perform what they feel inside. This idea challenges many traditional beliefs about the self that previous generations may have held. Um, so that this like traditional perspective is more closely aligned with the Christian worldview, where our relationships and obligations are what shape our sense of self. So, in simple terms, our identity is defined by the intersection of our lives with those around us. For instance, I identify as a son of God, a father of my son, a husband to my wife, a corrections officer, and as a disciple of Christ. And these relationships become more meaningful to me when I've made covenants with God to honor and cultivate these relationships and myself. So rather than looking inward by trying to find my authentic self, I find identity by looking outward and upward, towards those with whom I share a relationship and a sense of responsibility, and towards God to whom I am accountable. While some of these aspects have been consciously selected by me, others have not. For example, like much of myself is formed by the culture I grew up in, and the same thing goes with Kara. Like there's no like authentic self inside you just waiting to be found. Like there's some parts of you that were cultivated and formed by things that had nothing to do with you.
Yeah, love it. And I want to make sure, like, I want to still, man, if Kara has any pushback here, like when talking about conditional love being toxic, I guess as a general principle, I strongly, strongly disagree. But in those situations where you have members of the church who have OCD, members of the church who, yeah, struggle with like trying to live up to every standard in a conference talk, every standard in church manuals. The word for it is like I know I always have a hard
Scrupulosity.
scripturosity,
Yeah.
scrupulot. Yeah, yeah, however you pronounce
Scrupulosity.
that. And that can be problematic. I don't know. Do you have um any insight on ways that ways we can deal with that? Any data or any thoughts?
Yeah, so I got this book, haven't read all of it. It just came out this year from Deborah McClendon. She's a psychologist at BYU. It's called Freedom from Scrupulosity. Scrupulosity is basically like OCD in religious form. Although it doesn't have to be religious, it can just be like an extreme anxiety about moral issues. So if you're like a secular environmentalist that really cares about the earth, you could become really OCD about environmental stuff like recycling or whatever. Um, so we have to understand that OCD, scrupulosity, what she says in this book is that it's not ultimately caused by the religion itself. Like OCD, there's a lot of like genetic and biological components to it. And so like if the person has scrupulosity, problems with that, and they maybe grow up in a extremely religious family that is all about living rules, or they're in a ward that has like a toxic perfectionistic culture, that can make it worse. But the church doesn't ultimately cause that. It and in many cases it can help if they emphasize the right parts of the gospel that are right for that person, like grace. That the concept of grace can be very helpful. And the book is nice because it goes into certain scriptures and teachings in the church that are useful for people who have scrupulosity.
Awesome. Yeah, I saw that book at Deseret Book, and I think that's great that they're promoting it right now, because I know there's quite a few people who struggle with that. Just as, yeah, and every group on the planet have people who struggle with OCD. I have a little bit of OCD. I've never had it with religion, but just with life, and I love to see us tackling that as a church. So, you have any last thoughts on conditional love before we talk about occasional drinking versus religious
Yeah,
validation?
yeah. I want to get a little bit into the toxic perfectionism. Uh,
Toxic profession.
yeah,
Yeah.
because there was a recent review of the literature of all the studies that have been conducted on Mormonism and mental health between 2005 and 2022 by Justin Dyer and his colleagues. And they have a section that reviews the studies on perfectionism. And whenever we're talking about perfectionism, we have to make a distinction between adaptive perfectionism, uh, which is basically an attitude that leads individuals to excel in healthy ways. If they mess up, they have a lot of self compassion for themselves. They don't get anxious about it. They just try and do better. And then there's maladaptive perfectionism, which is the toxic perfectionism that many critics talk about. There's good evidence from the literature that the church mostly promotes adaptive perfectionism in its members. Um, so I'll just quote from that part of the study. It says several studies examined some combination of perfectionism, scrupulosity, and shame. Perfectionism can be divided into adaptive perfectionism and maladaptive perfectionism. And then scrupulosity is a form of obsessive compulsive disorder manifest in a religious context. Shame often includes making internal stable global attributions about oneself, which lead to negative feelings about the global self. And then it goes on to review the evidence. It says a study by Allen and Wang, published in 2014, classified nearly half of their Latter day Saint sample as adaptive perfectionists, with 30% being maladaptive perfectionists and 22% non perfectionists. Adaptive perfectionism was related to greater intrinsic religiosity. Now, it's important to define what intrinsic religiosity is. Researchers of religion have created two categories: intrinsic religiosity and then extrinsic religiosity. A person who is intrinsically religious is is religious as an end unto itself. They are people that truly, sincerely want to follow the central tenets of their religion. Whereas a person who is extrinsically religious, they're mainly doing it to gain social status, popularity. They're in it for just the outward benefits. They just attend church because everyone else is doing it. They're not sincerely in it. Um, and so when we show that adaptive perfectionism was related to a greater intrinsic religiosity, that shows that there may be a causal connection between actually living the central tenets of the faith and being an adaptive perfectionist. So that's good. And then it says maladaptive perfectionism was unrelated to intrinsic or extrinsic religiosity. So there were people in the sample that were LDS that were maladaptive perfectionists, but it was unrelated to intrinsic religiosity. So it wasn't really due to anything that had to do with the faith. It more than likely had something to do with uh, personality traits or maybe something in their family. Um, and it even goes on to say uh, that scrupulosity and family perfectionism intensified the link between scrupulosity and shame. So it's likely that it has something more to do with like genetic factors in their personality or something to do with their family rather than the religion itself.
Awesome. Is there is there literature kind of the best route to go for people who do struggle with toxic perfectionism in the church, in ways that we can help them, resources we can point them to? Do you know anything like that?
Right. So even if the church isn't the ultimate cause of their perfectionism or their scrupulosity, like it still needs to be a source of help for them. So this book actually has some resources, like just go see a therapist. Um, it also offers like some techniques you can use, well, mental exercises you can help that can help you. I haven't gotten to that part of the book, so I can't really give you any specifics, but just seeing a therapist that like preferably a faithful therapist, because some therapists will just say, well, just don't go to church anymore. Like, uh, yeah,
Yeah.
that'll solve it. And that may solve it for you personally, but again, thinking about like the effect that'll have on your kids and on society as a whole, what if everyone were to do that? Um, that you may have a therapist that'll say, well, you need to set boundaries, which boundaries are a good thing, but that can be taken too far as well. Um, Finding adaptive ways to deal with it without alienating yourself from your faith community is the best way to go. So just see a faithful therapist that knows about
Yeah.
uh, scrupulosity and how to deal with toxic perfectionism and help them understand grace a little bit better.
Yeah.
And
I my and the advice that I've given to myself and some of my close friends, I'm not an expert, so this is not something I speak on very passionately publicly. And I might get canceled from Orthodox Mormons for saying this, but I think it's always important to have a healthy relationship with the commandments.
mhm.
So let's take garments for example. And if you're struggling with garments and wearing them every day and the expectations with that, I think it's fine to say, you know what, how the covenant was worded, it's wear your garment throughout your life. I'm going to start right now and just wear my garment on Sunday. And I'm just going to continue with that for now because that works for me. And over time, I can readjust and reinterpret it. I think that's fine. I think it's better to have a healthy and positive relationship with the temple garment than to let it weigh you down and have it negatively affect your relationship with the church and with the gospel. And I do the same thing with callings. Like with your calling, find ways to make your calling healthy for you. Always magnify your calling, but if you're magnifying your calling to the point where it's hurting your mental health and it's damaging your relationship with the church, take a step back, readjust, reinterpret how you view your calling. Same with daily scripture study, daily prayer. Approach the commandments in a way that benefit you, that motivate you. They're there to make you the best person possible. So I think it's important not to let them weigh you down and damage your relationship with the church. But it's a little controversial, but that's my take.
I'm okay with that perspective, but I would just bring it back to uh, the Jordan Peterson quote. Like, think of how your actions, be cognizant of how your choices will affect uh, people that follow under your sphere of influence and look to you as an example. So, friends, family, children, descendants. Um, like, if you're going to do it for your mental health, make sure and like sit your children down and let them know, hey, like, I still believe in wearing the temple garment. I take this very seriously, but for my own mental health, this is what I'm doing. I wouldn't recommend it for you, uh, like as just a blanket solution to any of your problems. Just be cognizant of all the people that follow under your sphere of influence.
Yeah. And I would um yeah, I agree with that caution, and I also push it more towards Orthodox members of the church and um recognizing that if they push their perfectionism on their kids, that could be harmful as well.
Yes. Hmm.
I think it goes both ways. If you're taking a nuanced approach and you want to reinterpret how praise use the garment, fill your kids in, explain your philosophy to them, explain your mindset, explain how it still works, and then encourage them to, um, yeah, to to be faithful and follow.
Right.
Make it work for them. Same with perfectionism. Explain that to your kids.
Yeah, there is definitely generational perfectionism, toxic perfectionism within some families. And I don't necessarily believe that the church is the ultimate cause of that, but certain families' interpretations of church teachings only emphasizing the commandments and and the legalistic part of it without emphasizing grace can be very damaging when taken to the extreme.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, good. Shall we move to occasional drinking versus religious validation?
Yes.
So I thought this was a um pretty outlandish claim as well. That essentially she was attempting to say what's worse, going to a club and getting an occasional drink versus living your life under this toxic system that always is asking for validation.
Yeah, so like I want to use the Jordan Peterson quote as kind of the framework for this entire podcast when it comes to addressing what is harmful and what is not. Um, so it is true that an individual can drink and it not be damaging to them. They can drink in moderation, and it wouldn't like alcohol wouldn't be very damaging to them personally if they do so responsibly. Um, but it's kind of similar to the person like in a political election, the person who says, I'm just one vote. Like, what difference am I going to make? Well, not much. But when you have millions of people saying the same thing, the effect is actually pretty immense. And I'm not judging people who choose not to vote. The point I'm just trying to make is that when you have millions of people saying the same thing, in the aggregate, it ends up having a pretty large effect. So at the population level, alcohol is a very, very dangerous drug. It's responsible for all sorts of crime, drunk driving, domestic violence, sexual assault. Like, it's because it is legal and it is more widely used than other illegal drugs, it is the most criminogenic drug in existence in this country and probably the world. It is responsible for a lot of suffering. And, you know, people like Kara or a lot of, I don't know, cultural libertarians would say, well, why not just focus on the people that are on the problematic drinkers, the people that are doing that damage, and not focus on the people who are drinking responsibly and in moderation. And I would like to point them to a book. It's written by a guy named Philip Cook. He's an economist and a policy expert. His area of expertise is on alcohol policy. And he was actually part of a panel, a research panel for the National Academy of Sciences. Basically, the National Academy of Sciences will take like an issue within a certain scientific field, gather people who are experts in that field together, let them, and they'll write a report on like a consensus report or how we can better address the issue. An example would be this right here. Um, this is one that is more within my degree. It's called Proactive Policing. It's a consensus report on what policing practices are effective in reducing crime. He was part of a panel concerning alcohol policy. He wrote a book called Paying the Tab. It was published in 2007, but it has a lot of stuff that's still relevant today. Um, what he was able to find in his review of the research in this book was that as the more casual drinkers you have within a geographical area, the more problematic drinkers you will have. And there's likely a causal connection between those two. As one goes up, the other goes up. As one goes down, the other goes down. And a common theme throughout the book is that the policies that are most effective at reducing problematic drinkers, so reducing drunk driving, or reducing sexual assault related to alcohol, or reducing underage drinking, was not policies that address those problematic drinkers specifically, but by addressing per capita consumption. And here's a few relevant quotes from the book. He says, as per capita consumption declines, as it did in many Western countries in the 1980s and 1990s, the prevalence of heavy drinking will decline also. Indeed, the prevalence of heavy drinking typically declines proportionately more than the average consumption. Thus, if one group has twice the average consumption of another, it would be expected to have 4 times the prevalence of heavy drinking. And the 20% decline in average consumption in the United States in the 1980s and 1990s implies a 36% decline in the prevalence of heavy drinking. So basically, what he's saying here is that the best way to get problematic drinking, like binge drinking, down, you have to enact policies that address per capita drinking. So addressing those casual drinkers that are only drinking occasionally. Why is that? Well, there's a little thing called social contagion. It goes back to that Jordan Peterson quote that a man is not an island. His actions affect others. And the more casual drinkers you have within a geographical area, the greater there's going to be more bars in a geographical area. There's greater availability for people who are alcoholics, uh, for people who for teenagers. Like if their parents are casual drinkers, then they're more likely to get a hold of their parents' alcohol and use that alcohol. Um, Here's another relevant quote from the book. He says, a more radical proposal is that policymakers accept the implications of the fact that youthful alcohol abuse occurs in the context of adult drinking. A panel commissioned by Congress through the National Academy of Sciences to develop a strategy to reduce underage drinking concluded underage drinking cannot be successfully addressed by focusing on youth alone. Youth drink within the context of a society in which alcohol use is normative behavior, and images about alcohol are pervasive. They usually obtain alcohol, either directly or indirectly, from adults. Efforts to reduce underage drinking, therefore, need to focus on adults and must engage in the society at large. The truth in this conclusion is demonstrated by the close statistical connection between underage drinking and per capita consumption. Indeed, the panel recommended a national campaign directed at adults rather than youth, with the goal of persuading parents of the seriousness of the problem and gaining adult support for alcohol control measures and other effective measures. So in a secular society, like we have this problem with drinking alcohol. They address it through policy. The church addresses it through social pressure to conform to the word of wisdom. And it turns out that it's very effective. And uh, LDS youth, their drug and alcohol consumption is very low. And the social ills that are associated with drug and alcohol abuse are also very low among faithful members of the church. And so, Kara's question is, what's so wrong about an individual drinking a little bit of alcohol? Nothing. But there is something wrong with when an entire population is doing it. And even if you're not a problematic drinker, your actions can affect other people who may become problematic drinkers, like your children.
Yeah, love that. And my big issue is like Kara's making some big claims on Mormonism and how it's harmful, ignoring that the data clearly indicates generally. I'm not talking about when we get down into the weeds and the stakes and individual levels, which we always should be addressing the harm that's going on there. But generally speaking, the membership of the church is happier and healthier than the average human, than the average person. And so she's ignoring the data there, but she's saying, oh, but drinking's fine, when the data clearly indicates drinking provides no benefit to anybody, doesn't benefit you at all, and it clearly has a harmful effect on society. Like in your work, how many people do you see in the prison that are in prison because of Mormonism versus in prison because of alcohol? If you could put a ratio on it, what would you say there?
I can't, like, there are people that happen to be Mormon
500 to
that
1? Like
yeah, like there are, in Utah prison, there are people that happen to be
1,000 to
Mormon
1?
in prison. Yeah, but like, yeah, 1,000 to 1. Like, drugs and alcohol are definitely a huge problem among the population that I work with. Uh, Mormonism,
Yeah, like that
not
claim
so
is
much.
just crazy. That like that alcohol is somehow less harmful than Mormonism. It ignores the data, clearly. It ignores the data. And it's like alcohol, okay, I'm going to honestly, and this is a tangent, I think alcohol should be illegal. Shoot me. I think it should be illegal. Like when we look at the amount of deaths it causes, the amount of sexual assault that it's directly contributing to, when we look at the harm it does on society, the health and everything, the amount of like abuse that occurs underneath alcohol, spousal and children abuse, like it is alcohol is one of the most it is one of the most damaging things.
Hmm.
And to say that somehow Mormonism is more damaging than alcohol is just so unbelievably outlandish. I can't even wrap my head around it. Like, I feel like you have to be completely cut off from society and the damage that alcohol does to make a claim that absurd.
Yeah, well, and you remember the article I wrote for Public Square magazine about the low levels of sexual assault at BYU?
Yeah,
Yeah, like the most likely explanation, there's quite a few explanations, but the most powerful one is that it's a dry campus. There's no alcohol. And like I cited several studies and data in that article showing that especially the party culture at other universities, like whenever there's a party going on, you see an uptick in reports to the campus police on sexual assault in several of these campuses. And like I cited several reviews from the Rand Corporation showing that like when a potential predator is under the influence of alcohol, they're more likely uh, to assault someone, and that a potential victim, when they're under the influence of alcohol, they're more susceptible to being assaulted. And that's not victim blaming. That's just drawing a causal connection between the two. Uh, BYU is a dry campus, and the last two campus climate surveys have shown that sexual assault at BYU is much lower than it is at other universities, and it's likely because of the low alcohol consumption there. It's almost non-existent.
yeah, yeah. That's one of my. I love that about the word of wisdom. You know, I have some issues with how we interpret it today, but probably my favorite part of the word of wisdom is the suggestion to stay away from alcohol
Yeah.
because of we can clearly see the damage that it does to families, that it does to individuals, it does to careers. it just, yeah, it's a horrific thing that's going through society. And yeah,
Well,
crazy claim. I don't understand it. It feels completely delusional in my
yeah.
mind to make the claim that she
Well,
did.
I'd
But
like to use an example from like my own life as well. Uh, I brought up like generational stuff, like how your actions will affect generations, hundreds of years from now. So I have a great grandfather that was an alcoholic. Um, he was, from what I hear, he was a nice guy, a good man. He just struggled to overcome alcoholism and tobacco addiction. Now he ended up having three children with my great grandmother, and then they had tons of kids. But his three children were very faithful to the church. They lived the word of wisdom, um, and their all their kids, I'm pretty sure, for the most part, live the gospel as well. Now, alcoholism is highly genetic, so it's very likely that many of my great grandfather's descendants may have inherited that gene. But here's the thing: there's no way any of us will find out if we inherited that gene because we grew up in a culture that where drinking alcohol is completely unacceptable. Whereas if we had grown up in a family where it was okay to drink every now and then, have a drink every now and then, as Kara says, the chances of some, at least some of us becoming alcoholics would have gone up quite a bit. But because we grew up in a Mormon family, an LDS family, we were able to take all that generational baggage that came from my great grandfather and his ancestors and just nip it at the bud. And that's one of the gifts that the word of wisdom offers us.
yeah, yeah. And if we look at like the fruits of alcoholism versus the fruits of Mormonism, like the fruits of Mormonism is getting your family, having a happy family, studying the scriptures, trying to focus on Christ. Yeah, we could name off so many fruits of Mormonism. What are the fruits of alcohol? Like
The,
beating your spouse,
yeah,
beating your children.
the,
Like, like come on now. Like it's just it's crazy to me that you would make. Yeah,
the only benefits
go ahead.
that you could cite would be like a glass of wine a day is good for your heart, which that
Yeah,
is not a for sure thing. Like that, there's been studies saying that it is, some that say it isn't, and right now they're leaning towards that it isn't, and also that it's like a social lubricant. Like if you're in a social
yeah,
setting, like doing a business deal with something, it can help loosen people up. And but like just write down all the benefits, all the drawbacks for society, not just for individuals, and the drawbacks most definitely outweigh the benefits.
yeah. And compared to Mormonism, it's
Yeah.
insane. It's a crazy, crazy comparison. And the whole thing of like alcohol being a benefit in social circumstances, I think that's kind of BS too. Every situation I've gone in with people who are drinking, which is fine. I allow people to be drinking and at my home, wherever. I don't push my morals on other people. But whenever people are drinking, like they can't engage in any intellectual good conversation. They don't remember a lot of the stuff that was going on. Like it damages social situations, in my opinion, from my experience. So yeah, I don't know. It's probably enough on alcohol, but
Yeah.
I'm passionate about this one. Pisses me off.
Me too. Me too.
Before we dive into Stephen Hassan, we need to pay him to fix your issues. I think it'd probably be good to talk about, just so we can make sure we're addressing potential pushback we might get, is people might say, well, Mormonism, if we look at like Utah, for example, and like antidepressants or suicide levels in Utah, um, clearly Mormonism has a negative influence on the population. What would you say to that?
Well, the deep south has a lot of black people, and so therefore there must be a connection between the high crime in the deep south and black people. You see how, like, making a connection between,
That's a
yeah,
very problematic statement, right?
yes, it
Yeah,
is. So Utah has a lot of Mormons, and it has high suicides or high uses of antidepressants. That's a very superficial argument that you're going to need to qualify that with a little bit more information before you can draw a causal connection between the two. Just because there's a lot of Mormons within a geographical area doesn't mean that the Mormon church is the cause of it. And in fact, Um, so using Utah as a proxy for Mormonism is extremely problematic for a few reasons. It's like 60% of the state is Mormon, and only like 30 to 40% are active. So, like, you have to accept the possibility that the people responsible for these trends in Utah aren't even Mormon, or they haven't even been to church in like 5, 10 years. And so, with antidepressants, when we break it down by county, um, we find that the most Mormon county in Utah, which is Utah County, has the lowest use of antidepressants in the state. Whereas places like Carbon County, which is the least Mormon county in Utah, has high suicide rates and high antidepressant use. Uh, don't quote me on that. I think they have high rates of one or the other, or maybe both. I'd have to look at the data again. But when you break it down by county, like, we don't see that the more Mormon counties have more of these problems. Um, Another thing to consider is that when it comes to like suicide, Utah is part of uh, a part of the country called the suicide belt. This would be like Arizona, Wyoming, Idaho, Nevada, the Midwest, basically. And um, scholars have said that there are certain characteristics that all these states have that contribute to the high suicide rates, and that would be um, like high levels of gun ownership. There's a high percentage of Native American and white populations, which those are the two racial demographics that have extremely high suicide rates throughout the entire country. There's a lot of people living in rural areas where they don't have much access to mental health services, and it's a lot easier to feel isolated and alone. Um, Let me see if there's any other. I think those are the main factors. So you know what all these states don't have in common is the Mormon Church. Um, the church doesn't have much influence over Wyoming or Nevada like it does over Utah or Alaska. Alaska also fits the description of all those states as well. And so you can't, whatever is causing the high suicide rates, it's not something that is unique to Utah. It's something that's unique to those states. And the church is not unique to all those states.
Awesome. And I don't know if you would have a response to someone like, what if they push back and they say, well, since Mormonism's supposed to make people happy, we should expect it to be better than all these other places with these other common factors that affect the mental health. Shouldn't we? Yeah, shouldn't we expect Mormonism to be benefiting the state instead of just like kind of it's just the same as other states in its geographical area?
Well, we find that studies of Mormons in Utah, that is what we find, is that their mental health is significantly better than the general population. And
Yeah.
so when you restrict your study to faithful Utah Mormons, we don't find those trends. So it's other people that are explaining those trends. And another potential explanation is that because Utah has also been ranked as one of the happiest states in the United States, it is perfectly possible for a geographical area to have a lot of happy people and a lot of unhappy people. This is true for the Nordic countries. Like, they've been rated as some of the happiest countries in the world, but they also like have high suicide rates. Like, Sweden has similar suicide rates to the United States, and with not nearly as high gun ownership. And so, another factor that goes into Utah's um, high suicide rate is the high elevation. And so,
Yeah.
that was one of the things that I forgot to mention. But yeah, like, when you break it down by county, when you look at the context of everything, like other states around Utah, um, and and then when you look at studies, peer-reviewed studies that have been conducted of Mormons in Utah, we don't find that these problems are as prevalent in those populations.
Awesome. Love it. Well, yeah, moving to the liver can heal, but Stephen Hassan needs to fix. You need to pay him, specifically pay him.
Yeah.
That's what she said.
hmm
Liver can heal, but Stephen Hassan needs to fix your religious trauma. What do you think about that?
So she's referring to deprogramming, Stephen Hassan's deprogramming. So here's the thing. Deprogramming assumes that concepts like brainwashing or mind control are valid social scientific concepts, and they're not. Scholars back in the 90s determined that these are really just pseudoscientific terms meant to mask value judgments about a belief system or group that one doesn't like. Um, so after losing several times in court in the 90s and early 2000s, cult scholars broke off from modern academia and created their own scholarly journals. So basically, no one was taking them seriously. They got mad, and so they broke off from the rest of academia and created their own little space where they get published. They publish each other's work, but like they've been debunked for several decades now.
And that includes Hassan, right?
Yeah, his work, like he's put his own spin on it to make, and he's changed a few words around to make it seem like he's created something new. But his work is based off of like the work of people like Margaret Singer, and they were the ones that took all the major L's in the courts back in the 90s. There's a famous court case called U.S. versus Fishman, um, where the American Psychological Association and American Sociological Association, they came out with these amicus briefs and said like this is trash. Like these frameworks are basically like trying to, these people have an axe to grind against these groups, and so they're trying to use scientific terms to give legitimacy to their axe that they're grinding against these groups. And you guys need to do better, come with something better, otherwise like we're not taking you seriously. And um, so the courts are no longer allowed to use brainwashing as a valid concept to use against these groups, because people were suing groups like Scientology or the Moonies, saying that I joined this group because they brainwashed me, and so they were trying to get back at these groups, and the courts basically said, like, based off of what the American Psychological Association is telling us, these ideas are bunk, and so we're not going to let you do this anymore.
Yeah. Yeah, I think we should do a whole entire episode on Stephen Hassan. Maybe just pull some clips from the podcast he did with Mormon
Yeah.
Stories and do a response to him, because there's some good stuff there, and do I don't think we need to talk about it totally here, but like the bite model,
hmm
and if that applies to our church, as well as a little bit more background on Stephen Hassan and where he comes from, because I think there's some worthwhile discussion there. I think Stephen Hassan is a very problematic figure that the Ex-Mormon community is hoisting up. And I think it kind of destroys their credibility when they promote him as their prophet in a
Yeah,
lot of
yeah.
ways.
So,
So,
like, whenever I bring up the problematic history of cult models, um, when talking about Stephen Hassan, the pushback I've gotten from some TikTok exmos is like, you're referring to stuff that Stephen Hassan did back in the 70s. He's changed now. He's refined his theories. Like, no, the bite model was created in the 80s, in the heyday of the anti-cult movement. And it's based off of these qualitative interviews of people who have left new religious movements. And only recently was it subjected to a quantitative analysis in his dissertation that was published in 2020. Like, to put this into perspective, within my field of criminal justice and criminology, in order for a theory or model to be taken seriously, it has to be replicated several times. It has to be subjected to a literature review or meta-analysis. A model, in order for it to be valid, it has to be shown that it can either predict what it claims to predict. In this case, the model, if a religion meets all the characteristics of the bite model, then it should predict that this religion will cause harm. Hassan hasn't been able to demonstrate that. Or it should be able to explain the data with the fewest amount of assumptions as possible. And he's only recently in his dissertation been able to subject it to a quantitative analysis, when it needs to be replicated many, many times, and it needs to be bounced around by many different scholars. It needs to be critiqued, and his model
yeah,
hasn't been subjected to the correct amount of scrutiny that other theories and models within the social sciences are subjected to, until they're taken, in order to be taken seriously.
yeah. Yeah, I'm with you there. Yeah, I say let's do a future episode just fully on Stephen Hassan. Um, and we can do a response to him, and we can dive deep into all that. I think that would be a good time.
Yeah, well, I actually got into it in the comments with Kara in this video. I think you saw those. I screenshotted them and put it on the Discord. You remember that?
Yeah.
She actually responded, and we had a little back and forth. She tried to she tried to give a legitimate response, but then basically said, "Well, what authority should we appeal to? The spirit?" Like just like a bunch of cheap digs, and that's when I knew she didn't really have much of a response. But the the main
Yeah.
I'll just close this subject by basically saying that the problem with cult models is that they do include like legitimately harmful organizations under their umbrella. Like these groups have, it's been demonstrated that they are fundamentally harmful groups, like Nexium or even like Scientology or the Moonies. But the thing is that they also include groups that haven't been demonstrated to be harmful, but they challenge the social order in some way. Now, just because a group challenges the social order doesn't mean that it is harmful. But because these groups challenge the social order, they tend to make people mad. People become suspicious of them. And so therefore, anytime anyone does from that group does something bad, then critics of that group will say, "Aha, I knew that group. I knew those dang Mormons were up to no good." You see that happen with the church all the time. Like, so a Mormon happens to mess up, and then they make the news. Like, people are just so happy to see Mormons mess up for some reason. Um, and I think it's partly because they've accepted this idea of cults. Like, if a group meets these X, Y, and Z criteria, then they're a cult, and we should automatically be suspicious of them. When in reality, it hasn't really been demonstrated that that group is harmful in any way, shape, or form. And when it actually is subjected to like a peer-reviewed study of large populations, we actually see the opposite.
Yeah. Love it. Yeah, do you have any final thoughts on Kara's video in general?
No, I don't think so. Not on that one.
Awesome. All right, well, let's she has a second one I think we can run through real quick. Let me get it pulled up here. Where she makes some similar claims, and it's worth just addressing. While we're already here, it's worth addressing it. So
sounds good.
This clip is actually posted by Analyzing Mormonism, who we who we chatted about last episode, but she posts a highlight from, I think it's from a Mormon Stories podcast episode. So, all right, we'll just let her give her full perspective here, and we'll respond.
Just said that the fruits of the church are good, and I believe that with all my heart.
I believe it,
I believe that he believes it, and I used to believe that with all of my heart. I believed that the fruits of the gospel were true, and they did all of the same things that you said. And I had to recognize that I'm saying that as a person who's white, who's never had to deal with racist people in the church. And so I started listening to what Black members of the church had to say and other people of the church. And I said, okay, the fruits of the church for you have been rotten. Okay. Started listening to trans people, started listening to gay people. The fruits of the church was not happiness. It was devastation, and it was divisiveness, and it was suicide ideation. So I had to listen to people who were fundamentally born gay and say the fruits for them, the God's plan was not good. I listened to a lot of women, listened to a lot of people who felt like Mormonism stopped them from progressing because they were not of the right gender. And I started listening. Again, I wasn't a feminist. I was never a progressive Mormon, not once. I went from being as a very conservative Mormon, anti-feminist. So I started listening that a lot of people were hurt by the church. And all of the fruits that I saw was just, I like to see the happy families. I'm going to ignore the crying ones. I like to see the people serving. I'm going to ignore the ones who are going to serve dead people in the temple and not the ones of other faiths and other religions who also are doing great things, serving in soup kitchens. Sure. So all I'm trying to say is, like, it's really easy to say, like, yeah, we're upholding something that is true because of the fruits, but it's only easy to say that because from my perspective, I hadn't talked to enough people. I hadn't talked to enough people to see that the fruits are super easy to see when you look through a worldview like this, and you're ignoring all of the crying, all of the suicides. You're ignoring.
All right. Well, there we go. Yeah. I think there's a couple claims there we'll touch on. The fruits of Mormonism. She talked about how they're devastation, divisiveness, suicidal ideation, specifically for marginalized members of the church. And then she also talked, like, basically suggested the more people that you talk to, the more rotten the fruit of Mormonism is. So, should we touch on those?
Yeah, sure. I mean, we've already gone over the fruits of Mormonism. Like, I've already reviewed the literature in general, that the vast majority of studies show that Mormonism is beneficial, and that includes for women too. Like, uh, there's evidence that, again, women at BYU are less likely to be sexual assaulted. Um, there's evidence that sexual abuse is lower in the church, like of kids. I think Jennifer Roach, she was able to collect some data showing that abuse is lower in the church than in other religions. Um, there's evidence that, like, women, LDS women, have lower levels of eating disorders than non-LDS women. Um, we can link, like, my Substack article in the show notes so people can see the data for themselves. But the vast majority of studies show that Mormonism is beneficial for mental health, and that Latter-day Saints do have lower levels of suicidal ideation. The one that we probably need to touch on is sexual minorities, or those in the LGBTQ community. Uh, Critics may think that's an easy win for them. With the recent studies that are coming out now, it's not. Um, there are lots of studies that do show that Mormonism is bad for mental health for sexual minorities, but a lot of them are either conducted or co-conducted by John Dehlin. um, um, but if you restrict, there have been several studies that have come out from researchers at BYU and even non LDS researchers who aren't necessarily sympathetic to the church, that have shown that when you restrict the studies to only studies that have a representative sample of LGBTQ members of the church, with a comparison group, so sexual minorities of other religions or non-religious ones, and you compare them, you control for several variables, you actually find that LGBTQ members of the church have better mental health and lower suicidal ideation than other sexual minorities. It's not that simple. And the thing about the argument that Kara is making is, well, I talked to people, so I found out that the church actually hurts people. Like, that's not good evidence. That's not a representative sample. There's no comparison group. You're just talking to people who had a bad experience. And, like, I can make the same argument about vaccines. Like, I used to think that vaccines were beneficial for humanity until I started talking to people that were hurt by vaccines. Like, try telling that to the FDA. Like, have them pull vaccines off the market because you talk to people. Like, the way that we determine whether the church is harmful is by conducting studies of large representative samples with comparison groups. That is the most valid way to do that. And when you do that, you find that it's not that obvious that the church is harmful.
Yeah, I agree. That's really problematic rhetoric when you say, "Oh, I went and talked to people, therefore I can make a claim in general against the church." I could do that to promote bigotry towards practically any group on the planet. If I'm like, I'm going to go talk to people and find examples where people have been hurt underneath, like, their culture or their religion, and I can start making bigoted claims towards any practically any group on the earth I want. Take transgenderism, for example. And if I want to go and find people in the transgender community who've had a bad experience in that community, to then go say, that means all trans people, are bad, that would be a bigoted claim that I would be making. just because I went and talked to a couple of the people who've had a bad experience in that community. That would probably be wrong of me to do, to use those few examples to make a claim in the community in general. So I find that frustrating. I think there's a worthwhile conversation to be had about how we can best help, marginalized people in the church and help them have a better experience. I don't think the way Kara is going about it is productive or helpful. But I do think there's a worthwhile conversation there.
Right. Well, even if the church didn't cause their suffering, like it's still the Christian thing to do to try and ease their suffering. Uh, you don't have to be the cause of someone's suffering in order to help them. So I'm not against the church doing something to help people who are suicidal or who are suffering. Um, but the thing is that people like Kara think that the only thing like that the church can do to help them is to change its policy and doctrine on gays and on gender. That's the only way that they can help. It doesn't matter what else they do. Unless to do that, they are a bigoted church. And one, I would like you to show me any type of evidence that would suggest that if the church were to change its policy, that would somehow improve things for gay people. Because from what I see, gay people outside of the church aren't doing any better than gay people inside the church. That suggests that these people aren't living under Mormonism. They're not living under the oppressive policy of Mormonism, yet they're still suffering. They people who don't have any religion at all, these sexual minorities are still suffering. Even in like extremely tolerant countries like the Nordic countries that have tolerated sexual minorities for a long time, their suicide rates are still a lot higher than the general population. So we don't really know why. Like like critics like to claim that if we could just lower the amount of bigotry in the world, then their suicide rates would be the same as straight people or non-sexual minorities. But like there's no evidence to suggest that if the church were to radically change its policy on this, that they would somehow be better off.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. And I don't think what Kara is doing here is just slinging rhetoric towards the church and ignoring contrary data is helping any of these marginalized communities or people who are in the church who are struggling.
Now,
I think we as members of the church, we have a long way to go. I think the church in general and we as members to address these things, but just hurling, rhetoric and telling, how harmful the church is without engaging the data in any depth, that's not helping anyone. That's not benefiting anything. It's just criticizing the church and using people who are struggling as your weapon to do it.
right, like the more I see their criticisms, the more it seems like they're actually trying to win a culture war than actually help the people they're claiming to help. Because
Yeah,
like they're if you want to help people, you're going to use like evidence-based practices to help them. And like the church changing its policy, like there's no way for us to know if that would actually help them. Like just if you're actually concerned about helping people who are marginalized, then look at the evidence, see what actually helps them and do it rather than just like having this axe to grind against an organization that you don't like or trying to get them to radically change their doctrine. Leave us alone
yeah,
and actually do something that helps these people. You don't have to
yeah,
getting the church to radically change its doctrine, you're not doing them any favors.
yeah, yeah. I think the best way to address this harm is to do it, in your communities. I don't know, you do it in your communities as well as like for members of the church to address it from the inside. Like I'm always going to push back against any racism I see in the church anywhere. I don't care where it comes from. Like I'm going to fight very, very strongly against it anytime I see it. Same with homophobia. Any gay couple is welcome to come and sit next to me in sacrament meeting. Anytime I see um, a child being mistreated by their parents because the child is gay, I'm going to speak up against that. I'm going to challenge that. But I just don't think saying Mormonism is harmful, everyone should leave, that's not addressing the problem. That's not helping anyone. That's just, like you said, it's just fighting a culture war. the way to address it is to challenge it. And I think we from the inside have the best ability to do that, and we should.
Amen.
So, all right. Well, with that, I think we responded to Kara. I'm sure Kara will probably respond. I know she likes to do it. Sometimes she can get a little aggressive.
She'll probably make
so
fun of like our appearance in some way. Like,
yeah, I've seen that with other responses she's done. It's gotten pretty nasty. So
she'll probably bring up our
hopefully
gender
that we
too.
can.
She'll bring up our gender as well.
Yeah, we're two straight white males, so obviously nothing we have to say is of any value. Maybe. We'll see though. I hope Kara will have a thoughtful response. And I think the most important question that was what you gave in the beginning for a response is, and you could probably just repeat that, but about what does the data say against Mormonism that it can't also say about any other group? I don't know if you want to restate that again, your challenge.
Yeah, just when you say that Mormonism is harmful, like compared to what? What is the baseline that you're using
Yeah.
to make that statement? Because like you have to be using some type of baseline to compare Mormonism to. It could be other groups. It could be some standard that you've come up with, like perfection. Where between perfection and having no standards at all are you at? What are you comparing Mormonism to when you say it's harmful? And then give data to back up your claim. Is Mormonism, are people more likely to experience X harm effect than say other religions or the general population or atheists? Give us data, and I'll listen to it.
Awesome.
If you can legitimately show that this problem exists, I'm more than willing to roll up my sleeves and address it.
Awesome. Love it. All right. Well, with that, we'll finish there. And thanks for joining me, Jacob. And I hope everyone has a good rest of their day.
Thank you.